Go ahead, Alison.
Thanks, Sarah. What I didn't want to do was jump in there and put you totally off your game. But welcome to everybody to what is the Chamber's very first Economic Update Live. We've done research for a number of years, and primarily we've done that through our chamber network. So Dundee and Angus Chamber of Commerce is the local chamber that's part of the Scottish and the British Chambers networks. And both those networks do a lot of research with businesses. And our chamber in particular has got an incredible response rate. Our members and business contacts are just really great at taking part in surveys, at giving their feedback, at making sure their voice is heard, because really what's important about the research work that we do is we take the true life, real life stories from businesses, and we take those and we feed those into government. So today's report that we're announcing and releasing is obviously one part of that, but we regularly talk to the local authorities, Angus and Dundee councils. We talk to local government, Scottish government, and we had a round table not so long ago with Fiona Hislop to talk about the real key issues that are affecting businesses in this local area. But we also use all of your results to take that and feed in through the Scottish Chambers and the British Chambers work that's done, that's fed right into policymakers. And I think this week, so I think I'm right in thinking, I think it's week 17 of kind of remote working stroke lockdown. And some of you may be joining us this morning with a bit of a beer garden hangover, because yesterday was the first day that people could get out and about, and we were super lucky with the weather. So it was brilliant to see so many businesses in hospitality making those first steps to welcome people back, and great to see so many people out supporting local businesses. And I think that's the other thing. I mean, people will know that a Chamber of Commerce is very much a champion for local business, and that's absolutely at the heart of why we get out of our bed in the morning. We get out and we do our jobs in our chamber team to make sure that businesses can grow, can recover, can thrive, can support the people that they employ, support their local communities, and that we've got local businesses for local consumers to buy from. So it's all part and parcel, I think, of the same conversation, really. It's about buy local, but also it's about, we have a programme called Circular Tayside, and our ambassadors got together recently and talked about how should we think in the current and the business climate? What's the best way to think? And it was think global but act local. And I think that's an old Patrick Geddes statement that's well founded in Dundee and kind of comes from a very strong place planning statement. So yeah, I mean, I think that really that is a good place for us to open up today's session. And we've done a lot of research with Dr. Shona Dobbie since we went into lockdown. It's quite bizarre, the time, isn't it? Because, you know, already we're in the second half of the year, and yet it feels a wee bit like we're walking through treacle as well in terms of time. It's all a bit strange. But we've had an enormous amount of responses from business while we've been in lockdown to the research that we've been doing. So over 3,600 responses from local businesses on the key economic issues that are impacting you and your organisations. And we share, and we were sharing a weekly economic update from Shona during the early weeks of lockdown. We did, I think, 3 months of that work, and you can find that work on our About Us page on the Chamber website. So there's economic updates there. You can see the kind of the week by week reporting that Shona was doing on how the coronavirus crisis was affecting our local economy, how it was affecting the Scottish and the global economies as well. And it's interesting to see back those pictures. But what I'm really proud about is that we are now doing this, or we're now taking our quarterly economic work, which we've done for a long, long time. And we're part of the longest running business economic indicator work in the country. And so what we're now doing is we're now taking our local work. We have definitely ramped that up in terms of the number of responses we've seen this quarter. And a massive thank you to each and every one of you that took part in that research. It's a time of significant business need, that's for sure. But also, I mean, we will tell you about this. I'm trying not to give away Shona's thunder, but we've seen both sides of the coin in this work that we've seen. So, I mean, there will be many of you that will know businesses that are absolutely flying at the moment. And I think one of the challenges that I see, and I'm sure they see as well, if they're thinking brutally honestly, is how do they carry on riding the wave of what has been enormous potential and actually keep that going post-COVID. And I'm thinking of, you know, the local fruit and veg suppliers, or the ones that are in the kind of cleaning and the health and safety and the safeguarding types of business. You know, it's going to be a massive challenge for them to keep us buying from them, but also for them to think about how do we go from where we were before. We've had a bit of a change, and then we want to come out of this in some kind of a hybrid model. And I think that's also the message that we're firmly talking to businesses about. You know, we've massively adapted what we do as a Chamber of Commerce, but we won't stop doing webinars. We won't stop doing economic research at the level that we're doing. It's just how do you fit that into your new plan when and if we fully manage to come out of the situation. And this week in particular is going to be a very vital week for the UK economy, because we're joining a lot of people in pushing the UK Chancellor in his fiscal statement tomorrow to reduce costs on business, to deliver further economic stimulus. I mean, we need to see investment, and we need to see our Tay City deal investment and packages moving forward. The longer it takes for key significant infrastructure policy like that to actually come to fruition, the more that the project owners have to revise their plans, the more the cost structure changes, the more the big idea that they had 2.5 years ago needs adapted. So it's really important that we get that city deal project moving as fast as we possibly can. So I'm really, really excited to kind of bring this session to you today. This is a live conversation, so we will be talking to people that are on the webinar with us, and we'll be paying attention to the questions that are on Facebook and just trying as much as we can just to make this interactive after we've heard from Dr. Shona Dobbie. I keep giving her our sort of our Sunday name, and I'm sure she's blushing furiously. But Shona and I go a long way back. So we both worked at Alliance Trust, and the work that I was lucky enough to see Shona do there was, well, for somebody that's not an economist, was pretty mind-blowing. And we used to travel the length of the UK, and I would be the person that helped make sure Shona was on the stage along with other key speakers from Alliance Trust doing their thing. So I'm really, really pleased that we have somebody in our local area that's got such a huge reputation, and she's been really brilliant in the work we've done. Those of you that know me know that there's, you know, I can do detail, but it's not my favourite thing, and that's definitely not something you would say about Shona. Shona and Wendy Maltman from the Malting House that have helped us pull together this report and our presentation are absolutely detail people. And it's brilliant to have had their support. So I'm going to get out of the way now. The other most difficult thing I've got to do is share my screen and make sure that Shona's slides actually come up when they need to. So you'll have to bear with us a little bit for a bit of a double act. But I'm going to share my screen now and invite Shona to unmute herself and come on, and she will take us through our presentation, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. So while I'm sharing my screen, Shona, if you want to just come on.
Okay. Have I managed to unmute myself?
Yeah, I can hear you fine. Okay, and I'm hoping that you can all see the slides as well as I can. There we go. All right, Shona, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Well, I was thrilled to be asked to help with these economic survey, and the number of responses which we got was just amazing, and it's given us so much data to plough through. And as Alison said, I do love a bit of detail, so I've had real fun over the last few weeks. And what we're going to do today is talk about the results, but being an economist, I have to talk about all the doom and gloom as well. And I thought I'd start with one of the scariest slides, just to put the background into context. So this is the background against which the survey was conducted. And this is showing real UK GDP. So it's a measure of economic activity in the UK. The fact that it's real means we've stripped out any inflation effect. And if you look at the bars, the sort of turquoise coloured bars, you can see that we've had fairly muted, fairly steady growth since the financial crisis, probably around about 1% on average. And then in the first quarter of this year, which only included a week or two of lockdown, we had a fall of 2.2%. And if you look back at the start of the chart, you can see the financial crisis. The largest fall we had there was 2.1. So even in the first quarter, with just, as I say, a minimal impact of lockdown, we had already dropped more than we did at any point during the crisis. And the purple bar, which we've put in at the end, is showing the estimate for the 3 months to April, and that's down 10.4%. We've never seen anything like this. And the estimate which goes along with this is that during the month of April alone, activity fell by 20%. As I say, really uncharted territory. 5 times worse than we saw during the crisis. Led very much by construction, which saw activity fall by 18%. House building was down about 28%. Private commercial construction down 20%. Both manufacturing and services saw a decline of between 9.5% and 10.5%. But agriculture escaped and got off quite lightly with a drop of only 2%. So that's just trying to put where we are into perspective. As I say, it's really bad. It's 5 times worse than we saw during the crisis, but it's also really different. This is not a normal economic downturn. There's been no financial market bubble. There's been no surge in oil prices to curtail demand. This is totally different. And so we hope that the recovery from this will also be different and hopefully faster than we normally see. If we move on to the next slide, we can see the results which we've been given during this period of economic decline. So these are the key results from the survey. We're measuring net balance, which is using the same methodology as the Scottish Chamber of Commerce use. A net balance is calculated by taking the percentage of respondents who say that some variable has decreased away from the percentage who say it's increased. And that gives you a net balance. If it's positive, that tends to suggest that activity is increasing. And if it's negative, it tends to suggest that activity is decreasing. You can see on this chart, all of the readings are negative, probably no great surprise. So we've looked at revenue, online sales, orders, profits, cash flow, investment, wages and employment, and they're all showing a negative net balance. So in the case of revenue, just to go through again how you calculate a net balance, what we saw was 10% of respondents said that their revenue had increased. 23% said revenue hadn't changed, and 66% said revenue had declined. So we take the 66% away from the 10% who'd said revenue increased, and that's how we get a net balance figure of minus 56. These numbers are pretty bad. We have no history for this series, but as we look at the reports from the Scottish Chambers, we can see that most of the variables they've measured are reaching all-time lows. So we can presume that what we're seeing today is hopefully the all-time low, and that next time we do the survey, we'll start to see a lot more sort of glimmers of hope coming through. If you look at the last 2 bars, so wages and employment, the trend is still negative, but it's not as bad as any of the other variables. And I think this is telling us that the furlough scheme has been successful in limiting job losses. But of course, the question is, well, where do we go from here, and what is the state of the labour market? So if we look at this next slide, this is looking at claimant count. So what we're seeing in the labour market at the headline level is that the numbers are looking okay. The unemployment rate is still 3.9%. It didn't change in the last reading. But there are some signs of concern starting to appear. One example of that is that vacancies have fallen by 60% and are now at a record low. So we know that 9 million people have now been furloughed. That's almost 30% of all employment. So the government is now responsible currently for paying most of the wages of nearly 30% of employees. And the question is going to be what happens to those employees of all employment. So the government is as they have to come back. So this chart that we're looking at, the claimant count, is really looking at the people who haven't been furloughed and what's happened there. So the claimant count has jumped from 1.2 million in March to 2.8 million. So it's more than doubled in a couple of months. The number of people who are self-employed fell by more than 130,000 in the 3 months to April. And it's probably fallen even further since then. And of course, a lot of those people are now claiming benefits, and that's what you're seeing in this chart. So the danger for the labour market is going to come as the furlough scheme starts to unwind from the beginning of August. So initially, employers will be paying national insurance and pension contributions. Then in September, they'll also start to pay 10% of wages at least, then 20% in October. And under current plans, by the end of October, the furlough scheme will come to an end. And so the big question is, where are we going to be in November? Will businesses be able to return the majority of their workforces, or are we going to see unemployment shoot up, as we've already seen in the United States, where they didn't have a furlough scheme? So in the US, we saw unemployment shoot up to 21 million in May. It has fallen back a bit in June, and that's because 5 million people managed to return to work. But the unemployment rate in the US has fallen from 15%, but it's still over 11%. Our unemployment rate here, as I say at the moment, is 3.9. So the question for everybody is, are we going to see unemployment doubling here in the UK, or even tripling? And of course, every increase in unemployment does affect businesses. Even if it doesn't affect directly, then it affects businesses through your suppliers or through your customers. And any rise in unemployment usually brings a fall in demand with it. So it's going to be a difficult time, particularly as companies are already struggling as we move into this period. So the next chart is looking at how businesses in the area have assessed their sales so far. So it's giving us an idea of maybe how strong some of these companies are going to be as they have to start to unwind the furloughing scheme. So the change in revenue over the last 3 months, if you look at the small table, you can see the net balances. So for total sales, again, we've got the figure of minus 56. So that was because 10% of businesses said they saw revenue increasing and 66 said they saw revenue decreasing. So only 10% of local businesses have seen revenue increasing over the last 3 months. And then the rest of this chart is looking at sales on a geographical basis. So in each case, we're looking at the percentage of respondents who have assessed that their sales are increasing, remained constant or decreased in the last 3 months. And you can see it's fairly negative across the board. This is very similar to the results in the Scottish Chamber's economic survey. Current revenue is clearly under pressure. Of course, the big question is what's going to happen from here. But if we look at the initial readings, and in particular the turquoise coloured bars, which are showing you increasing revenue, we're quite keen to see where that is coming from. And in the local area, it appears to be coming from the agricultural sector, manufacturers, and some retailers have also been seeing an increase in revenue, presumably if they're selling essential goods or if they've got an online presence. So that has been quite encouraging. If we look at the negative bars, the green bars which are showing the firms who say that revenue is decreasing, it's been led very much by construction, hospitality, tourism, the oil and gas sector, healthcare, and also the trades. Probably because the trades in this area, the plumbers, the electricians and so on, seem to get a lot of work from the hospitality and tourist sectors. So they're sort of tied in there. So there's quite an interesting dichotomy between different groups, with agriculture, manufacturing, retailing doing okay. I mean, these numbers, it's all relative. These numbers are still pretty bad, but in relative terms, they're doing better. And whereas construction, hospitality, tourism, oil and gas, etc., all suffering really badly at the moment. So the question is, where do we go from here? And the next slide gives us, excuse me, an indication of orders. So that's telling us something about where sales might go. Again, we're looking at orders by geography, so we're looking at total orders, then orders from Scotland, the rest of the UK, and export orders. We've got the net balance table showing that the headline total net balance is minus 52. So unfortunately, it's not much better than the minus 56, which we saw for revenue. So that's indicating that it could be a slower recovery than we would ideally like to see. Again, if we're looking at where the deterioration has come from, it's the same sectors. So the negative bars are very much led by oil and gas companies, hospitality, tourism, and trades. And the positive numbers, which we're seeing, and again, it's a relative positive, we're seeing that coming from agriculture, manufacturing, and retail. So it's telling us that there's no quick change to the outlook for companies. If you've been struggling during the lockdown, it looks like the startup process could be quite slow. Whereas if you've managed to keep going through the lockdown and been lucky enough to see sales increase, then the orders are still coming through, and it looks like the movement out of lockdown will be easier. So again, a mixed picture across the region. And it's quite disappointing to see orders being so depressed still at the moment. So what we need to ask is, well, what impact is this having on confidence? And the next slide gives a lot of detail about the business optimism which we're seeing across the region. So we've got a lot of data on this chart. You can see we've listed all of the key sectors which responded to our survey. The pink bars are showing the change in optimism over the last 3 months, and the dark coloured bars are showing change in optimism over a year. So no surprise that in general, apart from arts and creative, every sector is less optimistic than they were a year ago. I mean, as I say, that's no surprise given that the survey was done during lockdown. You can see that there's some charts where things are as negative as they could be. So healthcare, hospitality, oil and gas, tourism, transport and storage, nobody was saying that their optimism hadn't decreased in these sectors. And you can see when you look at the situation for 3 months ago, it hasn't got any better. These sectors are still very negative. But again, given the nature of what they do, there's not really much surprise there. What we are seeing though is, 1 or 2 encouraging signs coming through. So some of the net balance measures of confidence for the last 3 months have turned positive. We've got 3 sectors where optimism has increased in terms of optimism for the confidence over the last 3 months compared with a year ago. So agriculture, manufacturing and retail. So no surprise that it's the same sectors that have been reporting that revenue is too bad and orders haven't been too bad. Naturally, their confidence is holding up a bit better too. We've had quite big swings in these sectors. So in agriculture, the swing in the net balance was up 33. In retail and wholesale, it was up 50 points. And in manufacturing, it was actually up 54 points. So although manufacturing has the lowest reading at the moment of these three sectors, it's actually had the biggest turnaround in sentiment. And I think it'll be really interesting to see the next set of results which come through when the survey is repeated and we show results in October, because hopefully by then we will be seeing a lot more change in this chart and more sectors showing some optimism. And the ones to watch are those sectors where we've seen a turnaround, but not by enough to move into positive territory. So we've seen encouraging improvements in confidence in business services, financial services, and education. So their net balances are still negative, but the trend is beginning to turn. As I say, some glimmers of hope there. So a really interesting chart, a good assessment by all the respondents of how they're feeling compared to a year ago and 3 months ago. And it is giving us a lot of information about the sectors which are doing okay and likely to emerge from lockdown fairly quickly, and those ones which are still struggling, such as hospitality and tourism. So the next chart is looking at the current operating capacity by sector, and they were looking to see which companies have been most affected by having to curtail supply. Across the region as a whole, operating capacity has been at 54%, but as you can see from the chart, there's a wide variation across all the different sectors. So again, there's two groups to highlight here. You've got sectors such as agriculture and finance and insurance who've been able to operate at more than 80% of capacity. So in the case of agriculture, that's obviously because we all still need to eat and we've all been looking for food. In the case of financial and insurance activities, it's probably because people have been able to make the transition to working at home and have been able to continue to work at more or less the same pace as previously. And then we see the sectors which are really struggling. So tourism only operating at 5% of capacity, and the hospitality sector at just 13%. But hopefully some of the changes which came into force yesterday, allowing outdoor cafes, etc., will start to help some of the companies in the hospitality sector. And of course, we're in the key months at the moment for tourism, so it is important that that sector is able to start opening up fairly soon. But apart from really understanding the cost structures, which is key in this, if you're operating on low capacity, you're still having to pay your overhead. So you really need to have a good idea of the whole structure of your costs, your fixed costs versus your more flexible costs. And you need to know where your break-even level is, and will you be able to operate at that level given some of the new rules about social distancing and some of the increased prices and need to buy PPE, etc. So companies are facing a lot of difficulties at the moment, and as I say, they're really going to have to go through the costs and look at all the detail of these things, and possibly reassess pricing strategies, because there are other factors which are really important at the moment. So operating capacity, not good at 54%, but we would hope next time round to see this number really increasing. But meanwhile, companies need to be very aware of the impact on their costs and their prices if they're only able to operate at a lower level of output because of some of the restrictions that are still going to remain in place. And these aren't the only things which companies are worrying about at the moment. This next chart is looking at some of the factors which the respondents have said are more important than they were last year. So you can see from the chart that taxation and inflation are pretty important, as is the whole issue of competition at this point in time, plus business rates. And then interest rates and inflation still mentioned, interest rates and exchange rates still mentioned, but not as critical as they have been at other times in the past. Concern about taxation has really been building in the last few weeks. Lots of speculation about how the government is going to rebuild its public finances after spending so much on this crisis. We've had unprecedented levels of spending introduced to help alleviate some of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. And there have been fears that, we would have to go through another period of austerity. But as I said, this downturn is completely different to any downturn which we've had in the past. And I think there's a lot of hope that the government will try to boost fiscal policy in order to stimulate demand and try to come out of the downturn that way, rather than suppress everything with a further increase in taxes. Mm-hmm. One of the reasons for saying that is shown on the next chart, which looks at government finances. A lot of numbers here. Again, I do like the detail, but the only ones we're really going to look at are the ones circled in red. So this is showing central government finances in April and May. So it's the first 2 months of this financial year compared with the first 2 months of the last financial year. And the column in the middle is the change over that period. All the numbers here, I should say, are billions of pounds. So taxes on production are £13.6 billion lower than they were at this time last year. So the column on the left is showing the difference in revenue received compared with last year, and the column on the right is showing how spending has increased. So if we look at the taxes, first of all, taxes on production, which are key to government finances, you can see that there's been a huge hit in terms of the loss of VAT revenue. So it's down nearly 9 billion from where it was last year, where you would expect it to be. And fuel duty, because we weren't able to drive anywhere, we weren't filling up our cars with petrol. So the government has lost 2.4 billion of revenue because of that. So big losses in taxes on production. If we move down the column to taxes on income and wealth, you can see the big loss is income tax. So already the government has seen a loss of nearly 6 billion in income tax compared to where they would have expected to be. And then at the bottom, or third bottom row, we've got national insurance contributions. So they're down 3.6. If you total all of these up, the government is down roughly about 25 billion in terms of the first 2 months of this fiscal year. If we look then at what they're spending on the right-hand side, you can see that the bulk of the spending has gone on goods and services, 11.2 billion. That has been largely spending on care homes, PPE, etc. Lots of procurement and services. Transfers to local government that has been a transfer of nearly 18 billion. Some of that has been grants such as the grant given to Transport for London and major projects like that. And then the final figure, the subsidies, 29.9, this is where the cost of the furlough scheme comes in. So this is including any subsidies, including the furlough scheme itself. So it looks as if spending has gone up by about 63 billion and revenue's gone down by about 25 billion. So all in all, you've got the government borrowing an extra 87 billion at this point compared to last year. But the good news is interest rates are really low. lots of governments are in this situation. It's not something which is peculiar to the UK. So it possibly is a better time for government to be borrowing to try and fix some of its deficit issues, rather than trying to increase taxes, which would maybe just endanger any demand which is there. But as Alison said, we've got a key speech tomorrow from the Chancellor Rishi Sunak, who is going to be talking about some of his plans. There's lots of speculation about maybe a holiday on stamp duty, a temporary cut in VAT. Also, there's growing speculation about households being given vouchers, which can only be spent in the hospitality sector and the tourism sector, which would definitely help to give those ones a boost. But we'll just have to wait and see, just wait 24 hours and see what the Chancellor comes up with. And that will give us a better idea of how we progress out of the lockdown. So that's taxation, which was one of the key issues for local businesses. The next chart is looking at inflation, which was also ranked as being a fairly major concern. But we have seen inflation fall significantly over the last couple of months. It was 1.5% in March, it fell to 0.9% in April, and in May it was just 0.7%. So it is halved just over a couple of months. And this chart is looking at the contribution to the decline in inflation. So inflation fell by 0.2 between April and May, and this chart is looking at why that happened. So apart from food and non-alcoholic beverages, where there's a very, very small increase in prices, probably because we're not seeing so many offers, we don't get so many buy one, get one free, etc. Every other sector is showing a decrease. So there's absolutely no pressure on pricing at the moment, just the opposite in fact. But obviously as we begin to move out of this, we will see some pressures beginning to build, and the question is going to be how much. We will get the June inflation report next week, which is probably worth looking out for, just to see if the headline rate stays roughly where it is or whether it does start to reverse and move back up again. I think when we do see inflationary pressure, it's going to be cost push inflation in pressure initially. So that's when businesses see their costs increasing and they have to try and pass it on to the consumer. Obviously, there's a lot of additional costs of operation now for many sectors. And as they try to comply with social distancing rules, the fact that they have fewer customers and maybe the need for PPE, etc., that's all going to add to their costs. And that's where, as I say, I think we could see some pressure beginning to come through in some sectors where demand has been holding up. But at the moment, very little pressure at all. And you can see that transport, recreation and culture were the biggest sort of pull downs of inflation. So obviously the petrol price fell significantly during this time. And with recreation and culture not being able to operate much, we did see this big drop in inflation. But as I say, we could be at the turning point already. Next week's reading will be very interesting. The next chart is looking at interest rates. This is one of the categories where there hasn't been too much concern, but I just thought it's worth looking at interest rates at the moment and the whole topic of monetary policy. The fact that the policy rate of interest in the UK at the moment is its lowest on record. And when I say on record, I mean all the way back to 1694 when the Bank of England was created. We've never had interest rates this low. We were sitting at 0.75 just before the pandemic crisis hit, and then we had 2 cuts within 2 weeks, taking us all the way down to 0.1. This means that the monetary authorities, the Bank of England, doesn't have a lot of firepower left. Yes, they can do QE, they can continue to buy bonds and help in that way, but they can't deliver much more in the way of interest rates. And there's just scope for 0.1 before we hit 0. And then the whole question of whether we'll ever see negative interest rates in the UK, or whether policymakers will tend to use other forms of policy, such as fiscal policy, to try and boost the economy. The previous governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, was at the start of the pandemic was very keen to point out that banks weren't the problem this time, and banks could help to be part of the solution. So the main emphasis is on trying to get the money flowing through the system from the banks into the economy by the provision of loans, and just helping to make everything work with a bit more fluidity. If we do go into negative interest rates, again, it will be completely uncharted territory. Some countries have already had to do this, and in Europe we have seen the negative interest rates for the banks. So this is the rate at which the central bank was willing to lend to the commercial banks. So they're trying to encourage lending by the banking sector. They don't want the banking sector to hold all of their reserves with the central bank. So they give a negative rate of interest. The banks then think, well, we're losing money by keeping it with the central bank, and they start to use that money to generate loans. So we have seen that working before, but it does get much trickier if you get to the point where you have negative interest rates for households. And in a lot of cases, they probably wouldn't be passed on. If you think about mortgages, we've got a lot of tracker rates and fixed rates. So even if the policy rate went negative, it's not clear that it would be passed on to the consumer sufficiently. So again, this is just giving another argument really for the need to invest our way out of this, that monetary policy doesn't have the scope to really help us to get out of this crisis, and that there's going to be a lot of reliance on fiscal policy. So with all of this in mind, how are the local companies feeling? Well, the next chart gives us some scope for a little bit of optimism. Again, everything is relative. But we were pleasantly surprised to see that 43% of local businesses who are trading in Scotland are saying that they expect their sales revenue to increase over the next 3 months. So that's much more optimistic than we were seeing when we looked at revenue over the last 3 months, one of the earlier charts. So it's a fairly consistent picture across the board here, whether you're looking at total sales, sales done in Scotland, sales in the rest of the UK, and export sales. You can see that there has been an improvement. All of the net balance numbers are positive, which is really good news. The numbers might still be quite low, but it's just encouraging to see a plus sign there and not a negative sign. So we have to take some encouragement from this. And we're not showing the same chart for orders today, but it's very similar. So we're seeing orders expected to improve, again, albeit from very low levels, but again, just encouraging to see that there is some light at the end of the tunnel. If we look at the sectors again and say, okay, where are these higher sales expectations coming from? There's no prizes for guessing which sectors are the most optimistic. So agriculture, manufacturing and retail have got the highest expectations for revenue over the next 3 months. But following close on their heels, we've got business services, education and the oil and gas sector also being a little bit more positive about the future than the past, which is encouraging. And again, the negatives led very much by the construction sector, healthcare, tourism, hospitality and the trades. So again, I mean, there's no great explanation needed there. They've suffered more in the downturn and is likely to just take a little bit longer for the recovery in those sectors. But we are beginning to see some signs, particularly in construction and some small moves in the hospitality sector, suggesting that, you know, we should see a pickup in activity the next time that we do this survey. So that's the revenue expectations. Then we come on to the final chart from me, which is pulling together a lot of these indicators. So what we're comparing here is the assessment by local businesses of the last 3 months and comparing this with their assessment of the next 3 months. And for revenue, it's very positive. So we've got the minus 56 net balance, which we saw at the start of the presentation for sales over the last 3 months. And that's now coupled with a positive net balance of 10% for sales in the next 3 months. So much more encouraging, huge turnaround there. And in terms of orders, very similar picture, as I said, a big turnaround from minus 52 to plus 10. Investment, also a turnaround. A lot of companies were just saying investment's likely to remain constant. So that's why you're not seeing such a big flip in this one, but it's an encouraging move and it's in the right direction. And in employment, we're seeing a small change. Again, it's in the right direction. The readings move from -7 to -6, but it's not a big move at all. And I think, as I said before, employment is going to be the big challenge as we move out of this phase of lockdown and working our way through the pandemic and into the next phase. Employment and the whole issue of returning workers from the furlough scheme is, I think, going to be the big challenge for businesses over the next 3, 6, 9 months. But what we're seeing here is encouraging. It gives us some hope that, you know, we will see our way out of this. Obviously, there's still a lot of uncertainty. The big risk is a second wave and having to go back down into lockdown again, whether it's at the local area or nationally. I mean, that would really have a huge hit to confidence. But hopefully that's something which we can avoid. And on the basis of what we're seeing, I think we have to be encouraged that even though these numbers are all still relative and they're still pretty low, the movement is generally in the right direction. So it's not like me as an economist to end on an optimistic note, but I'm going to do that and pass back to Alison now.
Thanks so much, Shona. I've just got a bit of a wry smile there because I'm as a raving an optimist as you'll probably get. So that's quite dangerous all around, isn't it? Right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. We have got a few questions. So what I'll probably do is I'm going to answer one first, and then I'll maybe see whether Bill would like to come in after I've done one question and just ask his question in person. So I'm just giving you a bit of a heads up, Bill. So one of the questions we've got is, what is the Chamber specifically now going to lobby for as a result of the data and the report that we're producing? And that's a complicated answer, but I think it's not one thing. It's sort of a basket of things. So I would say national measures that help cut costs. So, you know, we've already seen people calling for cuts to VAT and business taxation. That would go a long way to supporting businesses. Shona said businesses that have got fixed costs, but business costs in general were already, in the research that we were doing last year, causing concerns. And that's got to be weighed up, I think, with the fact that, you know, we all have costs to do business. So, you know, in Scandinavian countries, for example, there's a high taxation environment, but coupled with large-scale investment. So I think there's an understanding in some countries that, you know, there's higher taxation in order to see the benefit of that, and that's definitely a cultural thing. And I think we would have a bit of a way to go to get to an environment like that. However, you know, I don't say that lightly. We do a lot of work with chambers in Sweden, and we've got good connections in Denmark, and I've seen personally how that can make a difference and how that's welcomed in some bizarre way, which sounds really strange. However, I would think that's something short term that could be targeted. It could be targeted at sectors that need that support, or it could be done with a relatively broad brush that would give us all an element of comfort. Those of us that will have used the the option to take a little bit of time to postpone your VAT payments or other things, you know, that's all well and good, and it's very good to be able to get a holiday like that, but it certainly is just a payment holiday. And I know that there's also been an increased level of borrowing from businesses, and there are some people that I've talked to that are concerned about what does that mean in the first quarter of 2021, as you know, your bounce back loan comes due and your VAT bill is due again, and we've all been just desperately trying to claw our way back to some semblance of a bit of turnover normality in the second half of this year. So the next year is going to be significantly tricky for some sectors and some businesses. So some kind of national measure of support, I think, would be really, really key. But there are local measures that can be brought in. So, you know, at local authority level, there's been an enormous amount of support already. But there are measures that can be brought in at local level, such as powers to vary business rates. So, you know, could that be done to help some of the high streets get back to business? Would that support? I think we have seen businesses without physical premises fall through some cracks with business support, and that's not been a good thing either. So, but I think we've seen an unprecedented amount of government support, and if they haven't managed to solve how they fix those cracks yet, I'm not sure that they're going to manage to do them, certainly not with the broad brush support. So a bit of thinking on how we could do that, and anybody that's got any ideas, please feed them through to us, because we don't have all the answers, that's for sure. Continuation of the furlough scheme, particularly for some key sectors that are feeling pressured, I think that would make an enormous difference. I don't think I would put my money on that one. However, I think there's been a huge amount of money flowed into the furlough scheme, a much larger uptake of it than government expected, and that's, you know, how do you carry on with such a huge piece of stimulus like that? I think that's tricky, but there are some sectors that clearly, you can see by our results, need something and need some continued support. So yeah, I think that's my kind of next point, is that support for key sectors that are suffering, protection for food and drink producers. I mean, we've got, particularly in this area, some of the best local food and drink producers that there are, and yet in our large supermarkets you can still buy European strawberries for more than half the price of local fruit. So that seems to me ridiculous, and we have got some amazing produce there, and I would like to see, that's, I guess the last thing is, you know, to us, so let's do what we can. So buy local, fundamental, buy local, support your local businesses, but not just as consumers. So, you know, as business buyers, what are we each doing to make sure that we're buying from local companies? But also, you know, are you telling the rest of the business community what you do and what they can buy from you? You know, I think it's a bit of a shared responsibility there. We will tell the world what you do, and try and make sure that you know, your web services or your logistics or your legal services or your economic advice services are all bought locally. But you need to know what your story is, you need to know what your sell is, and then if we all bought more local, I think that would have a massive difference. And Shona talked about extra costs like PPE. You know, there have been some sectors that have got support with those costs, but not everybody. And you know, hospitality and leisure and retail now are going to have some much reduced revenue because of social distancing and much increased costs associated with that. We've all seen the beer gardens and how brilliant they all look, but none of that comes free. Nobody came around with government trucks taking off you know, places to sit outside and putting up shelters so that we could all sit in the Scottish summertime and enjoy our beer gardens. So enormous investment from businesses, and I think we have to get out and support them as much as we can. So that was, God, that felt a bit like a sermon. I'm going to stop now. I'm pleased to see Bill has put his camera on and looks like he's probably ready to come on and ask his question. So Bill, do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question?
Yeah, thanks, Alison, and thanks, Shona. It's been a very interesting presentation. Yeah, I'm a councillor in Montrose, and I was really just wanting to sort of ask you about oil and gas. I mean, clearly, the oil and gas price crashed before the COVID crisis, and we've seen massive cutbacks at, BP. I know Shell are currently engaged in a lot of huge cost savings. There's a lot of oil and gas companies in Montrose, Baker Hughes, NOV, Halliburton's, etc. From what I can see during the pandemic and the shutdown, they seem to have been operating. I don't know. I'm not going to say normally, but I know my next door neighbour works there, and he's been working normally. The car parks look pretty full. So while they may be expressing pessimism, that's probably got more to do with the oil price than the pandemic. So kind of almost to tease these two apart, because some businesses we could see a bounce back, but if the oil industry is driven by the worldwide price and what's happening there, then we may not see a recovery there. I know sort of locally there's been some job losses this year in the various companies that operate in Montrose. So really just your thoughts on that one, I think.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I agree. The oil price falling so much the trend was beginning before the pandemic hit. I think the pandemic exaggerated it then at the end, because it was the fact that supply was piling up and there was no storage for it, and that's why we ended up with a negative oil price at one point. But the general downward trend had definitely been in place as we were seeing fairly muted global growth. I think going forward, it's a question, maybe the exploration side of the oil industry is the side which is going to be hit hardest, because the oil price is still relatively low. Therefore, a lot of potential oil supply just wouldn't be profitable. So projects possibly being put on hold at that end. But further down the sort of stream, I think, as you say yourself, you're still seeing activity continuing. So in terms of the sort of service end, I think there's still a decent amount of work available. But we need to watch the oil price closely from here. I think as the world re-emerges from lockdown, we will see the oil price picking up a little bit as demand for oil increases. But we're still going to be living with a relatively low oil price compared to some of the prices that we've seen in the past, and that does obviously hit the profitability of the sector.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would probably just say that's the same thing that we're hearing too. So Baker Hughes, we've been talking to them a bit, and they certainly are relatively optimistic. I think, like many of us that can, they've seen quite a significant shift to people that can work from home, and then that alleviates a bit of pressure on social distancing on the actual work within the site. So and then there's also been a number of businesses in that industry who are classed as essential workers, in which case they've not had the pause that some of the other manufacturers. So it's interesting that manufacturing is a sector, Shona, that's kind of come up quite strong in optimism, isn't it? Because I know that certainly in the very early days of lockdown, we had some real issues with some manufacturers closing their doors altogether and saying, it's the right thing, we should close. And then their customers were saying, some of them, global customers, saying, well, why are you closed? We still need you to supply us. And I think slowly but surely a significant number of manufacturers adapted how they worked, brought in social distancing and reopened. So I think that's possibly partly coming through in some of the responses we're seeing. But certainly, yeah, I mean, the measures that will help the oil and gas industry that have been announced by governments are really welcome too, because I think you're absolutely right. It's not just current crisis related at all, is it? Shona, I've got a question that sort of ties a little bit into this, and then I'll ask Billy to come in with his. But I'm interested in what we're seeing globally are there, for example, we know that China is well ahead of us in terms of their timelines on this crisis. So are we seeing anything that we can learn from, either in how they've adapted coming out of lockdown, or what their governments are doing? Not necessarily just China, but, is there anywhere that is doing anything that others will pick up?
It's still fairly early days as we come out of lockdown, but what we have seen in China is, their attempt to get production back to previous levels. We've seen example of having another local lockdown again, which I think, we're now seeing replicated in several countries, as and when. I think Melbourne's gone into lockdown, in Spain as well. I think there's a local lockdown in place. So I think we've all sort of learned from that you don't need to, maybe national lockdown isn't always necessary. I think China has also introduced these household vouchers, not on a national scale, but possibly in Wuhan. And I would need to check that for sure, but I'm pretty sure they're one of the countries which has tried these vouchers. And again, there's growing speculation that this kind of thing could work here. We saw countries, all introducing their sort of version of furlough schemes and that. So I think every country has been watching what the others are doing and just trying to pick off the good ideas and follow suit. America has tended to go its own way. So they just allowed unemployment to increase, relied on their benefit system. And as I said in the presentation, they're starting to see unemployment fall again. But the unemployment rate is way much higher than you're seeing in any other country at the moment. But all of the rest of us are now having to face the possibility that unemployment could rise from here. So I think governments are all watching what each other is doing and introducing the policies which they feel are working well. And we're getting sort of cooperation in terms of being able now to travel from one country to another and have holidays in Spain, etc. I think all that kind of cooperation is something that we will see more of. But I suspect local lockdowns is maybe something we'll have to live with over the next year or so.
Thanks, Shona. Billy, do you want to come in and ask your question?
Yeah, thanks, Alison. Thanks, Shona. Most of the government support and most of the details you're talking about in the survey are really looking at bigger companies. And I was curious if there's any information on how startups have coped with COVID. They're too small to be able to claim a lot of the government grants that are out there. For most of them, the bounce back loan is probably the only option. But if you're in startup, your turnover is probably quite low, so you're not going to get a lot out of that. And a lot of startups are not really keen on taking on loans in the first place. So are there any figures on, to be blunt, how many startups have gone out of business?
Well, while Shona's kind of looking at what she's got, I would say, so one of the things that the Chamber's been doing is we got together in the very early days of lockdown and started a 3 times a week conversation with the local authorities, with Business Gateway and with Scottish Enterprise, to make sure that we were all, and Federation of Small Businesses, sorry, I should have said them, and we were all sharing knowledge and making sure that the key issues that were coming up, whether it was from the kind of the business side of the line or whether it was from the business support and the local authorities, that we were all really sharing information. And it was through forums like that we really began to push for extra support that was needed, because it was obvious that the big levers, the big government levers, were not going to be able to solve all the problems. And I still think they haven't solved a lot of the problems for people who are self-employed. If you're running a small business that you plough all your profits back into and then haven't got a profit measure to claim from national government schemes, it's really, really tricky. I think the only thing I would say is that, so for example, Business Gateway locally created a Survive and Thrive programme to help particularly address some of those small business issues. And they saw a reasonable demand for that, but it tailed off. What they saw quite significant demand for was growth. So not growth as in, stratospheric, we're going to take on 100 new people and sort of double our workforce, but business that was really keen to look at growth support. And there was also a concern, I think, possibly that there would be very few startups, and that would be uncertain as well then for what business support measures were out there and what people were actually doing. But as somebody that was made redundant in 2008 and started her business in February 2009, it's credit crunch and depression and these kind of scenarios that do make people start businesses. And so we've certainly been encouraging as much as we can there to be strong business support for small, tiny micro businesses that need it, that is not normally there, but also to make sure that the fundamentals of getting people started in business are as strong as ever. And just a very slight plug, the Chamber has just launched a membership at £100 for anybody in the first year of business, because we know that first year of business is a really tricky one. So we want to support, and sometimes people would look at a Chamber of Commerce and think, oh, that's for all the big boys, or that's for people that have got loads of contacts and have got loads of business confidence and they don't need to worry about any of that. But actually it's the very opposite. The Chamber of Commerce is there for anybody and everybody in business that wants to make new contacts, to open up their supply chain, that wants to find new business, that just wants to actually get some confidence and support that there's a business community that wants to work with them. So certainly I think, but down to the numbers, I suspect Shona is going to tell you not yet, but I would hate to steal her thunder. So Shona.
Yeah, thanks, Alison. It's difficult to get good data on this. I know that before all of this started, there was about 4.5 million self-employed people in the UK. And we know, as I said in the presentation, that over 130,000 self-employed people are not self-employed anymore. So the numbers dropped by at least 130,000. That was only up to April. So I would imagine during May and June that will have increased significantly. And when we get the next labour market report in the next couple of weeks, we should see how that figure is going, and that will give us an indication. I think it's going to be difficult. We keep hearing about the bigger companies, the ones that people have heard of. So, just recently it was Upper Crust, and I think overnight Pret a Manger running into difficulties. But of course, we don't hear about the one-man business, which is, just trying to get along. So it is difficult. And that's one of the reasons that I looked at the Claimant Count numbers as opposed to the big headline unemployment numbers, because at least they're just starting to pick up some of the stress among the smaller participants. In our survey, it's all anonymous, so we know what sector the respondents are working in, but we don't know. We do see how many employees they have, but we don't have much more information about what the company actually does, within that sector, to be able to pinpoint with any more accuracy. So I think initially a lot of the information is just going to come anecdotally and through the Chamber and so on. And then we'll keep watching the labour market numbers, see what happens to the Claimant Count figures. I think, it's obviously a huge challenging time for anybody running their own business. Lots of risks, lots of pressures. But as Alison said, there's also opportunities. And again, anecdotally, I know of a couple of people that have, been having a great time. They just hit on a niche product service that has been required during this period, and they've gone for it. And I think likewise, as we see people unfortunately losing their jobs as the furlough scheme comes to an end, some of these people will take the risk and start their own business. So again, it's all about confidence. And I think if confidence can be renewed and then stay at the higher levels, where we will see more small businesses remaining in business and new ones starting up. I think the big danger going forward is that we have a second wave and another lockdown, and confidence just gets destroyed. And that would, I think, make people think twice about taking a risk, at least, until there's a vaccine or a cure for this disease. So hopefully that won't happen. Hopefully we'll get away without a second wave and big lockdown, but I think that's the big risk to this.
Thanks, Shona. Sorry, Billy, did you want to come back in?
Yeah, it's just, I was going to say surprises me, but it's not really a surprise. It's more a disappointment that there are not figures relatively easily available for the number of startups and how they're progressing, because the government, both Scottish government and UK government, have put a lot of money into encouraging people to start up companies. So are we not tracking what's happening to them?
I think they definitely are trying. The issue with all of the economic statistics at the moment is that the whole process of collecting them has been impaired by lockdown. So in most of the economic statistics that I've been looking at for years and years, when you see them now, there's always this little health warning at the bottom about some of the challenges that they face during lockdown, collecting the data and so on. So I think a lot of the issue is just a delay, and we will see the numbers. But of course, if the delay is too long, it's too late, because by the time you see the number, it's a bit late to take any sort of remedy action against it. So, but I think it's not that they're not collecting the data, it's just that everything is being challenged at this point.
Yeah. Okay.
Great. Lynn, do you want to come in and ask your question?
Yes, thanks. I know that you, Alison, are particularly keen on the circular economy, and I was thinking, and I think we all know, that the new normal has to be different and it has to be greener. So I was wondering, when you were talking about the startups, if there are possibilities for startups in the circular economy, but just also to hear a bit about how circular Tayside is progressing.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. So Circular Tayside, for those of you that haven't heard us talk about it a lot, is a programme that our chamber in Perthshire Chamber works on with Zero Waste Scotland. So we've got a Circular Tayside manager who's, it's coming up for a year she's been in post, and her role is very much about supporting businesses to be more circular. So whether that's taking someone else's waste and making money from it, whether that's about your business thinking about how you can reduce your own costs because you don't produce so much waste, or whether you redesign something, a product, a service, or something that helps you be much more circular. That's essentially what our project does, is actually just sits underneath all those businesses and helps them answer questions, helps them with their business strategy, but also helps them access funding and support. And we've got a really great bunch of Circular Tayside ambassadors from all across our region who are real flag wearers for their own sector and their own business, but also just the green economy, green recovery and circular economy in general. We'll on our YouTube channel, we've got actually one recent event that we did, which was talking about circular recovery. So we had a number of people on there saying this is absolutely the future, and I think I would totally agree with that too. Whether it's the UK government or the Scottish government or the Scottish Economic Recovery Task Force, everybody is talking about green recovery and how we can make sure that not just bounces us back to where we were, as you said, Lynn. It's about a different looking future, and I think that's an enormous area of potential for everybody and for new startups for sure, because now there is a lot of support being put into place for that. So governments are announcing lots of funding. Zero Waste Scotland has got is looking at relaunching its business support at the moment. So businesses that are interested in either something completely new or adapting what they do can get significant business support from Zero Waste Scotland, up to 30 days of really high level support to look at your cash flow, look at your market research, look at your business strategy. But there's also innovation funding there. So Zero Waste Scotland will fund, from relatively small amounts up to, as far as around about £1 million for innovation, and but it has to be very innovative. I think that's, Zero Waste Scotland has not got an unending kind of pot of money for people that are just dipping their toes into being more circular and being more green in terms of their business setup. They're looking for those real innovations, and because I'm competitive as well as optimistic, I'd really like our area to have as much of the funding that's funded via Scottish Government and Zero Waste Scotland as possible. But we were talking on our webinar the other day about the different schemes that are available. So Innovate UK has got funding that's aimed at being more circular and innovation. There's European funding that we're still eligible that can be accessed for projects. So there's actually an enormous amount, and we're going to pull all that together and actually make sure that we publicise all those different mechanisms of funding support, because getting a new business going in this sector can be relatively cash heavy in the beginning, because there's often a lot of R&D. So we would also encourage businesses to look at R&D tax credits. That's never gone away. That's been around for a long time. And if you spend some time looking at something and put time and effort and investment into it, then you can then reclaim that back from your tax bill. So there's an awful lot people can do, but it's a huge opportunity. So whether you're a tiny business that just wants to think about somebody else's waste, or whether you've got a new product or service, or whether you've got a new shop that is about no packaging, we've already seen a lot of that in the last year already, but I suspect we're going to see a lot more of this as people really think about changing what they do and making it much more circular. That was a bit of a long answer, Lynn.
Well, that's great, Alison. I think it'd be lovely to have it all in one place, so that if we, as a councillor, if we come across people who want to be in that area of interest, then we can push all that information out to them. That would be brilliant. Thank you.
Definitely.
I'm going to have to leave. Got another one starting at 10.
Good.
Bye. Thank you very much. Thank you, Shona. Bye.
And I was just going to do one last shout out for a project that's very circular, and it's the social supermarket in Angus. So that just opened its doors this week, but I know that the ladies behind that have actually been doing an enormous amount of work to get food where it's needed in the crisis, and they've always been planning to have their social supermarket there. But there are projects like that in every corner of our area, and these are tiny businesses that need our support. So I think if I would leave you with anything, it's that buy local message, but spend local. So, if you're a business that can actually use a local business to get your products and services from, let's shorten the supply chain so that if we have a local lockdown, well, it's all here anyway, and we don't necessarily have to be too worried about movement of goods in and out, because we've just seen our whole ecosystem just become more circular. So I guess we don't really have any more questions. No, it doesn't look like there's any hands up. So Shona, I don't know if you wanted to kind of finish off with anything, or if you've done your bit and you're leaving a sigh of relief.
I would just want to thank everybody for participating in the survey. And the response rate was just amazing, and so much information there. And just to encourage everybody to please do the same next time round, so we can start to really build a good history of data that we can really start to identify trends and just be able to work more effectively. Yeah.
And I would just add my thanks, but thanks to you, Shona, for all your hard work. I mean, this wouldn't have been possible without having a local economic expert that could look at our figures and the data. I mean, in some ways we did the relatively easy bit. We just and I leaned on lots of people that I know that were just an enormous help to us in actually filling in this data. So yeah, I would add my kind of plea to Shona, please, please, please carry on supporting us and filling in these surveys, because we do need to understand what's going on. And if you've got, you know, like Billy has raised a question about small companies and startups. So if there's something, there's an angle you think we could be looking at, then, you know, please let us know. If you are, you know, the other end of the scale, if you're a really large corporate and actually feel like there's, you know, helping us shape some of this work would be of real interest to you and what you do, then please let us know, because this is definitely just the start of us really building this, and we're already doing very well, I would say, in terms of the national picture, in terms of how many responses we get in our local area. But that's the competitive streak in me again. I you know, it's good that we're very representative of our local area, because we need those numbers in order to understand what's going on in the data. So please keep supporting us. Thank you to you if you joined us on the webinar, if you've watched us back on YouTube, or if you were on Facebook Live. And thanks to Sarah for getting us all organised. Thank you to Wendy at the Malting House for helping us with our report, and thanks again to Shona for all her help. Enjoy the rest of your day, folks. Thanks very much. Thank you.